and go. Chapter 31. The Harmony of Interests. The doctrine of the harmony of interests is central to the free market economy and has been ably expounded by such scholars as Ludwig von Mises. Mises speaks of, quote, the theorem of the harmony of the rightly understood interests of all members of the market society, end quote, and the fact that it rests on, first, quote, the preservation of the social division of labour, the system that multiplies the productivity of human efforts, end quote, and second, quote, that in the market society consumers' demand ultimately directs production not good enough. That in the market society consumers' demand ultimately directs all production activities, end quote. The exposition by von Mises is an excellent but strictly economic analysis. The concept of the harmony of interests goes deeper. It is a moral response to a metaphysical fact. We can understand the religious roots of the doctrine by examining also its alternate. Too close. We can understand the religious roots of the doctrine by examining also its alternate, the theory of the conflict of interests, economically stated as, quote, the class struggle, end quote. Mises, in a telling paragraph, comments on the idea of, and quote, what was that? Mises, in a telling paragraph, comments on the idea of an, quote, irreconcilable conflict, end quote, quote. Such is the almost universally accepted social philosophy of our age. It was not created by Marx, although it owes its popularity mainly to the writings of Marx and the Marxians. It is today endorsed not only by the Marxians, but no less by most of those parties who emphatically declare their anti-Marxism and pay lip service to free enterprise. It is the official social philosophy of Roman Catholicism as well as of Anglo-Catholicism. It is supported by many eminent champions of the various Protestant all the word. Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. Oh, snaps. Thanos snaps all around. As well as Anglo-Catholicism. It is supported by many eminent champions of the various Protestant denominations and of the Orthodox Oriental Church. It is an essential part of the teachings of Italian fascism and of German Nazism and of all varieties of interventionist doctrines. It was the ideology of the Sozialpolitik of the Hohenzollerns. Okay, well, come with me on a trip in that case. Hohenzollerns.
Hohenzollerns.
No, that's German.
Hohenzollerns.
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 Hohenzollerns. Zollerns.
Hohenzollerns.
Hohenzollerns. Hohenzollerns. Hohenzollerns. Hohenzollerns. Okay. Hohenzollerns. It was the ideology of the Sozialpolitik of the Hohenzollerns in Germany and French royalists aiming at the restoration of the House of Bourbon-Orléans, of the New Deal of President Roosevelt, and of nationalists of Asia and Latin America. The antagonisms between these parties and factions refer to accidental issues such as religious dogma, constitutional institutions, foreign policy, and, first of all, to the characteristic features of the social system that is to be substituted for capitalism. But they all agree in the fundamental thesis that the very existence of the capitalist system harms the vital interests of the immense majority of workers, artisans and small farmers, and they all ask, in the name of social justice, for the abolition of capitalism." End quote. Mises cites the documents of various religious groups which espouse and further a belief in the conflict of interests. Pope Pius IX, no, that's not 9, that's 11. Pope Pius the 11th. Pope Pius XI gave it status in Quadragesimo Anno 1931. William Temple expounded it as Archbishop of Canterbury in Christianity and the Social Order in 1942. Emil Brunner in Justice and the Social Order 1945 as a neo-Orthodox theologian advocated the same theory as did the Russian Orthodox thinker Nicholas Berdyaev in The Origins of Russian Communism 1937. A World Council of Churches draft report of September 1948 on, quote, "The Church and Disorder of Society," end quote, also championed this concept, end quote. This faith in conflict was, of course, basic to the position of Karl Marx, who hailed the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species as basic to the triumph of socialism. In 1960, he wrote to Engels on first reading Darwin, quote, "This is a book which contains the basis in natural history of our view," end quote. A few weeks later, Marx wrote to Lassalle, quote, "Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a basis in natural science for the class struggle in history," end quote. When Darwin would make up the words all the time. With Darwin, the idea of an irreconcilable and necessary class conflict had found a biological and implicitly metaphysical basis. The theory of evolution has given emphatic tenability to the theory of the conflict of interests. Life is a struggle for survival, with every species of animals and plants struggling to survive at the expense of all others. The early social Darwinists used this theory to justify a ruthless form of monopolistic private enterprise. They assumed a conflict of interests and acted as cutthroats against one another and against labour. The socialists disagreed in that they, while assuming the same conflict of interests as natural, deplored it and believed that the state is a necessary agency to arbitrate and resolve that conflict by continual coercion. Thus, while the, quote, "robber barons," end quote, welcomed the conflict as Darwinists, confident of victory, the socialists believed in the conflict but sought victory for the proletariat by capturing the state and turning it against the, quote, "exploiters," end quote. In both cases, Darwinism and the theory of evolution were and are basic to the dogma of the conflict of interests. But the theory of evolution is itself an expression of a metaphysical presupposition and a religious faith which goes back through Hegel to Greek philosophy. It rests on dualistic and dialectical presuppositions. If reality is divided into two basic substances which are irreconcilable, then either the world is sharply divided into two warring aspects, or If dialectical tension holds reality together, conflict is written into all being as a metaphysical necessity. There is a war between light and darkness, mind and matter, law and love, the gods and the devils, and so on. This conflict is metaphysical. A difference in being forever separates the two realms. For the Bible, reality is very different. God is uncreated being, all the universe and man, created being. The conflicts in the world of created being in the universe are not metaphysical but moral. Man has chosen to rebel against the sovereign God and to defy his law word. Because God created all things, quote, very good, end quote, Genesis 1:31, this war against God is unnatural. It means a violation of man's own being, a deformation and a torturing of himself to wage war against God. Conflict is a moral choice by man, and it is an unnatural and forced course of action. It is suicidal. Proverbs 8:36, quote, but he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death. Conflict is thus an immoral, unnatural, and suicidal choice by man. However, if a man holds to a Manichaean, Neoplatonic, or dialectical philosophy, he will hold metaphysically to a belief that the life of the universe is a conflict of interests. Western philosophy and religion have been largely dominated by a belief in dialecticism. The Greek dialectic of form or ideas versus matter gave way to the scholastic nature versus grace dialectic, an adaptation of Aristotle. This in turn gave way to the nature versus freedom dialectic of the modern era. Dooyeweerd has analysed these various dialectics. His followers, unfortunately, follow too commonly the conflict of interest theory because of the implicit dialecticism of their position. Their doctrine of common grace leads them back from a Thomistic form of natural law and a restatement of the Thomistic dialectic. The doctrine of the conflict of interests manifests itself in every area of life, so that its implications are more than economic. One example of this theory is the idea of the war between the sexes. Supposedly, men and women have goals and natures which put them in conflict with each other. No. I made it up in my mind. I said it from my big mouth. Supposedly, men and women have goals and natures which put them in conflict with one another, so that the best one can hope for is an armed truce. An almost Manichaean hostility to the other sex guides and motivates men and women. The other sex is seen as a source of irrationality, corruption, and sin. In the Arabian Nights, as in other Muslim writings, women appear clearly as the source of evil and as the corrupters of men in society. Feminist writings, however, are prone to making this same conclusion about men. Where such attitudes prevail, a normal relationship between men and women is impossible. On principle, war is waged, or at the least, suspicion prevails. Men and women work to take advantage of each other on the premise that, if they do not, they will become themselves the victims. Another area in which the idea of the conflict of interests affects our everyday life is in the so-called generation gap and the war between old and young. We are assured that adolescence is a period of biological rebellion, whereas in most societies, adolescence is a time of the closest imitation of and association with the older generation. Our humanistic and evolutionary culture fosters rebellion. When every aspect of life is at war with every other aspect, and all creation is in a state of struggle and war, then it is natural to assume that a younger generation will assert itself at the expense of the older generation. The idea of this inevitable conflict saturates our evolutionary culture, and it is not surprising that our youth have absorbed it. The idea of conflict extends to every area of life. It becomes the principle of action and also of prayer. Man feels that, in praying, he is coaxing God to give man something against God's will, as though a conflict of interests exists between God and man. However, the more a man grows in faith and obedience, the greater will his harmony of interests with God become, so that prayer is increasingly the communication of a harmony of interests rather than an argument between two wills in conflict. As already indicated, the doctrine of the harmony of interests, a doctrine unknown outside of Christendom, rests on the fact that God made all things, quote, very good, end quote, Genesis 1:31, in harmony with his purpose and calling. The fall of man was a declaration of war against God by man and an assertion that conflict between God and man is inescapable because of God's jealousy, Genesis 3:1-5, and necessary for man to prosper. The thesis of Satan was that God is jealously hostile to man and is lying to man. God is man's oppressor and deceiver, according to Satan. Yea, hath God said, Genesis 3:1. God is a liar, Genesis 3:4, trying to prevent man from realizing his own potential divinity, Genesis 3:5. The way to success and blessings for man is by conflict with God, by a defiance of God's will. This was the Satanic thesis, the conflict of interests. After the floods, the covenant of God with Noah, and with your seed after you, quote, and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, for all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth, end quote, was, quote, an everlasting covenant, end quote, Genesis 9 and 10, 16. It includes every man born since then, and every living creature, as well as, quote, the earth, end quote, itself, Genesis 9:13. The rainbow was given as a sign of the covenant, a most remarkable fact. There is no evidence of rain prior to the floods, but rather a dew, Genesis 2, 5 and 6, in semi-tropical conditions from pole to pole. No doubt, for many generations, as long as the memory of the flood was fresh, every raindrop which fell was a fresh reminder of the horror of the flood and of God's war against man in his sin. Now the rain led to a fresh reminder of God's covenant of peace, Genesis 9, 13-17. Whatever judgments which would occur in times to come, prior to the end of the world, would be partial judgments, and their purpose would be to recall man to obedience to God. The flood and the rainbow would be reminders that the only tenable kind of life is in harmony with God, and man's calling is a harmony of interests with God. A covenant is a contract, and a failure to abide by its terms, Genesis 9, 1-7, was and is punishable by judgment, capital punishment for murder. The heart of the covenant, however, is the fact that it declares that man's way to life and prosperity, as well as the welfare and advance of all animal life, rests on harmony with God. The nature of creation is such that man flourishes and abounds under God when he walks in harmony with God and his covenant law. The purpose of that law is not to frustrate man nor to introduce trouble into the world, but to bless and prosper man. The universe is God's law order. Man's prosperous and successful functioning therein requires that man's interests be in harmony with God and his law. Man, as he faces the universe, responds to it in terms of an ethical presupposition. If he believes that God or an evolving universe is trying to frustrate man in man's legitimate development, and if he believes that reality is basically hostile to man, then his response to the world will be in terms of a belief in the conflict of interests. His morality will be one of egoism and a dog-eat-dog philosophy. He will assume that the gains anyone makes will be at the expense of someone else. His perspective will thus be implicitly or explicitly atheistic because he denies that any sovereign God orders all reality in terms of a holy and personal goal in which all creation will find its glorious liberty. Romans 8:18-28. Economically, he will be an interventionist or a socialist, politically, a statist. However, if a man believes that the sovereign God is working with absolute and predestined certainty for the glorious liberty of all creation, Romans 8:21-22, by Christ's redemption and in his law order, then that man will see God-ordained purpose and harmony as the dominant and growing fact in the universe. He will be neither a statist nor a socialist. He will recognize that, while conflicts exist, they are the results of moral choices, not metaphysical necessities. Basic to reality is the great variety of all things, whereby God uses each and every person and creature in terms of his sovereign purpose to further the harmony of interests which ties all reality together. If the doctrine of the harmony of interest is limited to economics and the marketplace, it perishes because it is rootless. Only when grounded in the sovereign purpose, calling, and goal of the triune God for creation does the doctrine flourish and function in terms of its moral implications. Political conservatism in the 20th century, being greatly influenced by evolutionary and neo-Hegelian thought, is largely rootless and schizophrenic. A classic example of this is the John Birch Society-oriented book. Hang on. A classic example of this is the John Birch Society-oriented book by Gary Allen, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, 1972, which strongly asserts the conflict of interest philosophy. Not surprisingly, the Los Angeles Free Press, a leftist newspaper, gave it a good review, as John Smith, a Birch leader and 1972 American Party candidate for President of the United States, stated in a Free Press interview. The Marxists and the rightists have come to agree on the supposed fact that a conflict of interest is basic to our society and that a capitalist conspiracy is at the heart of that conflict.
None dare call it conspiracy. They ain't got the chops to call it so. They're not in the know. They don't know. They're not switched on.
All right. Hope to see you in chapter XXX11. Aye, aye. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.